My folks always acted like I was some kind of miracle, like I could do no wrong, while they practically erased my sister from existence. When she died, they brushed it off like she was nothing and still threw a big party for my birthday. That's when I decided enough was enough. I used Ava's diary to finally expose them for the people they really were and, in one perfectly timed moment, tore down the happy little lie they'd been living. As a kid, they treated me like royalty. Like I was some rare gift the world was lucky to have. Every small thing I did was praised, like I just cured cancer, and anything I asked for, I got. I brought home average grades? Didn't matter, I'd still get taken out to my favorite restaurant. I was 6 years old and already getting $35 a week as allowance. And of course, they plastered every detail of my life online, bragging to anyone who'd listen about their perfect son. But the thing is, I wasn't their only child. My sister Ava was 3 years younger, and to them, she might as well have been a ghost. In their eyes, she was nothing more than a screw-up who didn't deserve a second glance. They barely mentioned her to anyone, some of their friends didn't even know she existed. And that was the craziest part, because Ava? She was incredible. Smarter than me, more athletic, way better at making friends. But our parents didn't just ignore that, they actually worked against her. They'd make her quit clubs or purposely let her grades slip just so I wouldn't feel less than. I saw how much that crushed her. There was always this look in her eyes, like she was holding back tears every second. When I was 8, I sat her down and made her a pinky promise. I told her that from now on, I'd be the best big brother she could ever ask for. And I meant it. From then on, whenever she came home with a good grade, I cheered her on like she'd won a gold medal. I used my allowance to buy her little treats like ice cream or snacks she liked. I'd trick our parents into showing up to her games by pretending I wanted to go. And every time they ignored or downplayed her accomplishments, I made sure she knew that I saw her, that she mattered. Over the years, we got really close, closer than most siblings ever get. But life has a cruel way of cutting the good things short. I was coming back from my first year at college, and my parents had planned this huge bash for my 19th birthday. I told them I didn't want anything big, but they just steamrolled over me like always. I kept saying it wasn't important, but what I really wanted was time with Ava. She was 16 by then, still bright and full of life, even after everything they'd put her through. When I brought her up, they laughed. Actually laughed. Said, "Why would you waste time with the family disappointment?" I didn't even respond. I just focused on seeing her again. A few days before my birthday, Ava burst into my room, her eyes lit up, holding this scrapbook she'd been putting together for months. It was filled with pictures, notes, old memories, little pieces of our childhood. "It's not done yet," she said, beaming. "I just need a few more things to make it perfect." I pulled her into a hug and held her close. 3 days later, it happened. She was on her way to pick up art supplies for the scrapbook when she got into a terrible car accident. She didn't make it. I dropped to the ground when I heard, sobbing so hard it felt like my chest would rip open. And my parents? They just exchanged a quick glance, cold as ice. My mom's first words were, "We'll need to change the party plans." The days that followed didn't even feel real. They held a cheap, rushed funeral like it was just another task on their to-do list. Meanwhile, they were still obsessing over decorations and food for my birthday. When I begged them to call it off, my mom just smiled and said, "Life goes on. Ava wouldn't want to ruin your big day." But all I could see was them putting more thought into a cake than they did into burying their daughter. Cleaning out her room wrecked me. I sat there surrounded by her drawings, her clothes, her notebooks, tears pouring down my face. That's when I found it, her diary. I started reading, and every word shattered me a little more. She wrote about how invisible she felt, how rejected she was by the people who were supposed to love her. But not once did she blame me. One line stuck with me, "Max is the only one who sees me. He makes me feel like I matter." Her scrapbook was there too, still incomplete. At the funeral, I gave a eulogy that had everyone crying except for my parents. They stood there like statues. Afterward, my dad pulled me aside and whispered, "Let's move on now. We've got your birthday dinner at 7. I felt sick. My birthday came, and the house was decked out like some kind of magazine photo shoot. Gifts piled up, a giant cake that read, "Our perfect son," sat on the table. I sat there, still numb with grief, until my mom chirped, "Stop sulking. Max, Ava had her moment yesterday. Today's your turn." It hit me like a freight train. I stood up, my hands shaking, and asked how they could possibly be celebrating anything right now. My dad looked me dead in the eye and said, "You've always been the special one." Ava understood that. Something inside me broke. I let it all out. Every memory, every moment, everything Ava ever felt but never got to say. I told them how cruel they were, how I'd spent my entire life trying to protect her from their poison. My mom rolled her eyes and called me dramatic. My dad shrugged and said, "We still have you. Let's focus on that." Tears burned down my face. I grabbed the cake and threw it at the wall, frosting and crumbs exploding everywhere. "I can't do this," I said, barely holding it together. My mom started fake crying, accusing me of betrayal. My dad threatened to cut me off financially. I looked at them, cold and empty, and said, "You already did, in every way that counts." I started packing. My hands were shaking, but I was determined. I took Ava's diary and the scrapbook. Those were the only things worth saving. I was ready to leave, but my mom wasn't done. She stood in the doorway, blocking me. "You're not going anywhere," she screamed, her face twisted with rage. I tried to push past her, but she grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I instinctively pulled away, and she stumbled back, hitting her head against the wall with a dull thud. My dad ran to her side, checked if she was okay, and then turned to me with nothing but hatred in his eyes. But I didn't back down. I stood there, clutching Ava's diary, my dad's face twisted in pure rage as he lunged at me, shouting that I had no right to take family property, and trying to rip Ava's diary out of my hands. I dodged him and backed toward the front door, heart pounding, telling them I was leaving and there was nothing they could do to stop me. That's when he threatened to call the cops, said he'd report me for theft and assault. For a second, panic shot through me. I realized they could actually try to take Ava's memories away from me. Without thinking, I shoved the diary and scrapbook into my backpack. Mom, who had been crumpled on the floor, suddenly sprang to life, putting on her usual theatrics, crying, wailing, saying she'd forgive me if I just stayed. But I'd seen too much. Her tears felt fake after everything she let Ava go through. I tried to stay calm and told them I just needed space, that I'd be staying with my roommate, Thomas, for a few days. I figured maybe if I sounded rational, I could de-escalate things. Dad seemed to cool down a bit at that, and after a long pause, he stepped aside. But right as I was about to walk out, he leaned in and muttered, "If you walk out that door, don't expect us to pay another dime toward your tuition." That stopped me cold. The weight of what he said hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd worked hard for college, but they were still footing the bill, and now I was staring down the possibility of losing it all. But then I thought of Ava, of what she endured, of how little money meant in the face of what they'd taken from her. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Some things matter more than money," and walked out. Thomas let me crash at his place, no questions asked. I was emotionally wrecked, barely sleeping, but at least I was away from them. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. But 3 days later, I got hit again, this time financially. My debit card was declined when I tried to buy groceries. I checked my account, and it was empty. Then my credit card stopped working too. In a panic, I called the bank and found out my parents had yanked me from all the joint accounts and canceled the cards they co-signed. Just like that, they cut me off completely. I scrambled to apply for emergency aid through my university and picked up every shift I could at my part-time campus job just to keep my head above water. And if that wasn't enough, they started poisoning the well, telling the extended family I'd gone off the deep end after Ava died, that I was mentally unstable and violent. People I'd grown up loving either started avoiding me or messaging me like I was some kind of ticking time bomb. Feeling more alone than ever, I turned back to Ava's diary. I needed to hear her voice, even if it was just on paper. But what I found was so much worse than I'd expected. Page after page, she wrote about emotional abuse I never knew about, moments that happened when I wasn't home. And in one entry, she hinted that our parents had purposely sabotaged a scholarship she'd earned, one that could have gotten her out of that house for good. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I'd promised to protect her, and I'd failed. I knew I couldn't change the past, but I could damn well make sure people knew the truth. I reached out to Ava's best friend, Barbara, hoping she might have more pieces of the puzzle. We met up at a coffee shop and I started telling her everything. But as we talked, I noticed someone sitting in a parked car across the street, staring right at us. My dad. Creeped out Barbara and I headed to her apartment instead. Once we were safe inside, she told me something that made my heart stop. Ava had been secretly recording our parents for months before she died. She'd used her phone to capture arguments, threats, all of it. After the accident, Ava's phone had been returned to her parents, but luckily, she'd backed up some of the files to a shared cloud account she used for school projects. Barbara still had access. We sat there for hours listening to the recordings. One had our mom telling Ava she was a mistake. Another had Dad threatening to send her off to boarding school just for outshining me. It was all right there, undeniable proof. Armed with the truth, I made up my mind. I was going to confront them one last time. I showed up at the house, ready to speak my piece. But I walked in to find them throwing a dinner party, surrounded by friends, playing the role of grieving parents. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I hit play on one of the recordings from my phone, letting my mother's voice fill the room. We only wanted one child, Ava. Max was enough. You could have heard a pin drop. The whole room went silent. Their guests just stared, eyes wide, like they'd been slapped across the face. My parents immediately tried to recover. Claimed Ava edited the audio, twisted conversations, manipulated things. But my Aunt Lisa, one of the few relatives who had ever treated Ava kindly, stood up and called them out. She asked them directly if they had always treated Ava differently. From there, the dinner unraveled. Some guests left in uncomfortable silence. Others stayed, waiting to see what would happen. My dad pulled me aside into his study and tried to bribe me. Said he'd start paying for college again if I just stopped this nonsense and tell people the recordings were fake. I looked him in the eye and told him I wasn't going to betray Ava. Not again. Not for anything. His expression changed. He went from pleading to threatening in a heartbeat. Said he'd sue me for defamation. Said I was destroying the family. It was always about image with them, never the truth. When I walked back into the living room, my mom was putting on a show, crying to the guests about how I was such an ungrateful son. But Aunt Lisa wasn't buying it. She was flipping through Ava's scrapbook, the one I brought with me, and she noticed something: how every family photo included me, but barely any showed Ava. And the ones that did were ones Ava had taken herself, just the two of us. Lisa stood up and asked them flat out if Ava had won awards, where were the photos? Why hadn't they ever celebrated her the way they celebrated me? That's when things really exploded. My parents, clearly cornered, tried to take the scrapbook and my phone from me. But Aunt Lisa and her husband stepped in, physically standing between us. Then Dad lost it. He shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "Fine. We never wanted her. Are you happy now?" And just like that, whatever support they had left in that room vanished. The guests left fast after that. It was just the four of us standing in that wreckage: me, Aunt Lisa, her husband, and my parents. My folks scrambled to take it back, claiming they were just upset and didn't mean it. But I didn't stop. I played more recordings, each one peeling back another layer of what Ava had endured. Every word proved just how deep the emotional abuse ran. Eventually, there was nothing left for them to deny. Aunt Lisa looked shaken but firm. She offered me a place to stay and even said she'd help with college expenses. But the moment she did, my parents turned on her too, threatened to cut her off from the family if she took my side. Aunt Lisa didn't back down. She stood firm and told my parents she'd always suspected something was wrong and that one of her biggest regrets was not stepping in sooner. She made her choice right there. She was with me no matter what they threatened. Before I left with her, I went to gather the rest of Ava's things. But when I got to her room, I realized my parents had already started packing it up. Her entire life was stuffed into boxes marked donation, shoved into the garage like trash. I tore through them, pulling out her art portfolios, her awards, anything that still held a piece of who she was. I felt like I was saving parts of her all over again, fighting to keep her from disappearing entirely. Over the next few weeks, Lisa and I poured our energy into honoring Ava properly. We worked together to create a memorial scholarship in her name at her high school. We used her artwork, her stories, her accomplishments, everything they tried to erase to tell the real story of who she was. But then, like clockwork, my parents lawyered up. They accused us of slander, demanding we stop using Ava's name, her photos, and even her drawings, claiming it was family property. It was another way to control her, even after death. So we pivoted. I reached out to Barbara and some of Ava's closest friends. They gave us their own pictures, memories, and art projects Ava had worked on with them. We rebuilt her tribute from the ground up, this time told through the eyes of people who had actually loved and valued her. On what would have been her 17th birthday, we held a memorial art show at her school. We displayed her work proudly and announced the scholarship in her name. I should have felt proud, but inside I was overwhelmed. The guilt gnawed at me. Could I have done more? Could I have saved her? As I stood there, surrounded by classmates, teachers, and neighbors honoring her, I quietly slipped the final pages into Ava's scrapbook. I added photos from the memorial, words from friends, and a letter from me. It wasn't just a book anymore, it was a promise fulfilled. I had sworn I'd be the best brother I could be. And even though she was gone, I was still keeping that promise. That night changed something. Teachers came up to me afterward, saying they'd always noticed how differently my parents treated us. Some said they'd suspected abuse, but never spoke up because my parents were well-respected and always had neat little excuses. That's when it really hit me, my parents hadn't just fooled me. They'd built a perfect mask for everyone else too. With Aunt Lisa's support, I finally started therapy. It was tough, but it helped me work through the guilt and grief that had been eating me alive. But healing wasn't a straight line. One day during a session, I started getting a flood of texts from Barbara. My parents had shown up at her house, demanding she delete the cloud backups of Ava's recordings. They were threatening her with legal action, trying to scare her into giving up the last real pieces of Ava's voice. I rushed over. Barbara's parents were shaken and considering backing down just to avoid trouble. I sat with them and explained everything, why those recordings mattered, what they revealed, and how important it was to preserve Ava's truth. My dad tried spinning it, saying I was just exploiting Ava's death to paint them as monsters. But Barbara's dad, who used to work as a counselor, saw through them. He calmly asked my parents to leave and warned them that any more harassment would result in a restraining order. After that, word started to spread around the community. Slowly but surely, people began distancing themselves from my parents. Their perfect image was cracking. So, in true fashion, they staged a PR move. They made a big public donation to the school in Ava's memory, acting like grieving parents doing good in their daughter's name. I felt sick. They ignored her while she was alive, and now they were using her as a prop. That's when I realized I needed real distance for my own mental health. I changed my phone number, blocked them on every social media platform, focused on school, focused on healing. But somehow they still found a way in. They got a hold of my class schedule by telling the department secretary they were planning a surprise for their grieving son. One afternoon, they ambushed me on campus, making a scene about wanting to make things right. I walked away as curious students watched, feeling exposed and violated. The campus counseling center helped me file for a no-contact directive. It gave me a little peace. For a while. Then they tried a new angle, my roommate, Thomas. They cornered him when I wasn't around, told him I was in a fragile mental state, and asked him to keep tabs on me. Thomas meant well, I think. But soon he started acting weird, monitoring my comings and goings, asking too many questions. One day, while borrowing his phone to call Aunt Lisa, I saw the texts. He was reporting everything back to my parents. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I decided to flip the script. I started feeding Thomas carefully planned misinformation. Nothing dangerous, just enough to steer the narrative. I told him I was thinking about writing a personal essay for a psych class about family dynamics. I casually mentioned I was nervous about including the recordings because I wasn't sure if they were legally obtained. As I expected, my parents took the bait. Days later, I got a cease and desist letter from their lawyer. It accused me of stealing family property and demanded the return of Ava's diary, the recordings, and all related materials. But in doing so, they revealed something critical. They confirmed the recordings were real by trying to silence them. By that time, I'd already made multiple secure backups with Lisa's help. Everything was protected. When I showed the letter to my therapist, she didn't hesitate. She called it what it was, more emotional abuse. She encouraged me to explore legal options to protect myself fully. I met with a family law attorney. She went through the diary, the recordings, the letters, everything. She agreed the abuse was clear, but warned me that going to court would be long, expensive, and emotionally draining. Instead, she helped me write a strong formal reply to their legal threats. In that letter, I laid everything out, specific examples of their neglect, their emotional manipulation, and how they'd failed both Ava and me. I ended it with my terms for any future contact. If they wanted any kind of relationship with me again, they had to do 3 things. 1. Acknowledge what they did to Ava. 2. Agree to family therapy. 3. Stop using Ava's name and image in public like they had mourned her in life. Instead of answering me directly, my parents took a more dramatic route. They showed up at Aunt Lisa's place without warning, insisting they needed to talk to me face to face. Lisa gave me a heads up while I was still at work, telling me to stay away until they left because their behavior was starting to spiral. Once my shift wrapped up, I decided to head to Barbara's instead. But as I merged into traffic, I spotted my dad's car tailing me. I started making random turns just to be sure, and sure enough, he stayed glued to my bumper the entire time. So I drove straight to the nearest police station, explained what was going on, and asked for their help. An officer had a talk with my father about harassment. That encounter with the police stopped the following for a little while. But it didn't take long for my parents to switch tactics. They began contacting my professors, spinning stories about my supposed academic decline. Luckily, Dr. Jeffrey, a professor who had lost her own sister, saw right through the act. She got me in touch with the dean of students, who quickly put measures in place to better protect my privacy and safety on campus. Once the university was looped in, I finally felt like I could breathe a little easier while at school. But then my parents pivoted again. This time, they started spreading a narrative among our family and mutual friends, accusing me of withholding Ava's ashes and keeping them from getting closure. To set the record straight, I reached out to the funeral home asking for documentation. They confirmed my parents had declined to receive Ava's remains, choosing the most inexpensive disposal option. That official document exposed another lie, and it finally opened a few eyes in the family. People started catching on to the manipulation. But backed into a corner, my parents made one last desperate attempt to regain control. They came to my workplace under the pretense of a family emergency, hoping I'd come outside. When I didn't budge from my post, they made such a scene that my manager threatened to call security. It almost cost me my job. After that mess, I knew it was time to face them head-on. I set up a meeting in a public park and asked Aunt Lisa to be there as a witness. But when we showed up, I was blindsided. They'd brought along a whole group of relatives and friends, trying to stage some kind of intervention over what they called my unhealthy obsession with Ava's death. I stayed calm and spoke directly to the group, asking them if they even knew why they'd been invited. Then I hooked my phone up to a speaker and hit play on a series of recordings, damning clips of how my parents had treated Ava over the years. My dad immediately tried to grab the phone to stop the playback, but Lisa stepped in to block him. Everyone stood there, listening in growing disbelief as my mother's voice came through, telling Ava she was nothing compared to me. The longer the recordings went on, the more uncomfortable people became. A few tried to walk away. But my parents wouldn't let them leave, insisting that the recordings were misunderstood or taken out of context. Then my cousin Benjamin, who had always been close to Ava, stood up and spoke from the heart about the way he'd seen her treated during family events. That cracked the dam. One after another, people began sharing moments they remembered: Ava being overlooked at Christmas while I was showered with gifts, her efforts dismissed, the endless comparisons. It was like the truth had finally found a voice, everyone adding a piece to the puzzle that revealed the full picture. My parents got more and more defensive, eventually yelling that they were being attacked. Then something unexpected happened. My usually reserved grandfather stood up and said, "I've heard enough," and walked away. Almost everyone followed him. The only ones left were me, Lisa, and two family friends still clinging to their loyalty. That's when my father finally dropped the act. He looked at me coldly and said they had always known I was the special one and Ava was just average. But I had one last card to play. I pulled out Ava's academic records, proof that she'd qualified for advanced classes and had been denied those opportunities by my parents, who had signed the rejection letters themselves. The truth hit hard. The last two supporters quietly walked away, leaving my parents standing there, alone for the first time, with nothing left to hide behind. In the weeks that followed, I started to hear from extended family. They apologized for not seeing things sooner, for not stepping in when Ava needed them most. I appreciated the support, but deep down I wrestled with the question: where were they when she was alive? To make something meaningful out of all the pain, I started a family group dedicated to recognizing emotional abuse and favoritism, hoping our story could serve as a wake-up call. My parents made one more weak attempt at control, threatening to sell our childhood home, the place where I believed more of Ava's belongings might still be hidden, unless I agreed to drop all this nonsense. But Aunt Lisa and Uncle Paul stepped in, offering to buy the house themselves, which shut that plan down fast. Before they moved in, I went through the house top to bottom and found something I didn't expect: a hidden box full of Ava's awards, certificates, and things she was never allowed to be proud of. Meanwhile, the Jessica Limro Memorial Scholarship started gaining real traction. Donations came in steadily, enough to support 2 students every year. Still, a part of me worried that over time people would forget who Ava really was, the person behind the scholarship. So I teamed up with Barbara and Ava's old art teacher to put together a permanent exhibit of her artwork at the school gallery. That way, her talent would keep inspiring others long after the grief faded. As the one-year anniversary of Ava's death drew closer, I braced for the emotional weight of it all. But instead of sadness, I found healing in finishing a project she never got to complete. A children's book she'd been working on, about two siblings who could only see the stars when they were together. I partnered with a local publisher and released it under her name, Starlight Siblings. All proceeds went to her scholarship fund. At the launch event, I half expected my parents to crash it and cause another scene. But instead, I received a small envelope from them. Inside was a short note admitting they had made mistakes with Ava and her tiny hospital birth bracelet. It wasn't the heartfelt apology I had hoped for, not enough for reconciliation, but it was something, a rare flicker of honesty after years of denial. And in that moment, I realized it was just enough for me to keep moving forward. Through the scholarship, the art exhibit, and now the book, Ava had finally been seen. No longer silenced, no longer invisible. Her story told in her own light, and her legacy built on creativity, courage, and resilience. In my own quiet way, I kept the promise I made as a kid, to be the kind of brother who'd never let the world forget her.